Chapter 4. The Get On In. It didn't take Daring Do long to trot, fly, and gallop her way through the winding forest toward the Appaloosan Trail. It was a perilous trek, for it was steep cliffs and rushing rivers, but surges of adrenaline brought on by the promise of a new adventure had propelled her for the last several hours. A massive old tree with a trunk as wide as a canoe came into view in the distance. Daring rarely relied on landmarks after the wandering tree incident, but she didn't really need to. Her sense of direction was impeccable. In fact, her cutie mark was a green and gold compass rose. But this specific tree meant she was about halfway to Mount Vesuvius and the Tri-Corner villages. Her map confirmed it. The air was beginning to chill, and the sky had turned a dusky gray, exposing a canopy of pinprick stars and a low, glowing moon. The cacophony of crickets and furry scavengers rustling through brush grew louder as the night came to life. Daring surveyed her options. She could keep heading south and arrive by sunrise, or she could take shelter for the night. After her long stint on Captain Pony's ship and her swift exit from the cottage, she was finally beginning to feel the weight of exhaustion. Whenever Daring Do could barely flap her wings, she allowed herself a short rest period of trotting. With each step she took, the weariness pulling on her hooves reminded her of the cinder blocks that were once strapped to them by Ahuizotl in an attempt to stop her from stealing the rings of Scorchero. She had to face facts. The pony needed rest. The surrounding trees provided adequate cover to make camp, but the cold crook of a trunk seemed less inviting than the prospect of a soft bed made up in white cotton linens. Daring Do shivered and carried on through the darkening foliage. Just a bit farther, she thought. I will not surrender to something as silly as sleep. Soon enough, a plume of smoke could be seen puffing out from the chimney of a barn about a mile away. Daring picked up her pace to reach the front door. The Get On Inn was a little barn and breakfast, run by a crusty old unicorn mare named Mrs. Trotsworth. The stout patroness kept a cozy complex with 10 individual barns. They were available to rent for a small nightly fee, and included a hearty meal or two. Daring's mouth began to water at the thought of the scrumptious carrot and apple stew she'd devoured the last time she'd stopped in. The best part of the place was that Mrs. Trotsworth never asked any questions about who a pony was, or where she was headed. The less she said, the better, just the way Daring liked it. That way, no pony could get into trouble for knowing too much. The adventurer never knew who was on her tail. Daring knew that coming up against Ahuizotl and Dr. Caballeron made her a target, and when a pony was a target, she couldn't keep anybody close. Working alone was the best way to avoid situations. Daring saw the inn through the trees. The wooden sign out front swung in the gentle breeze, creating a creaky sound like an old playground seesaw. Daring was relieved to see that the hooks below the sign bore the word vacancy. The rocky path to the entrance crunched beneath her hooves as she walked. Once inside, warmth enveloped the Pegasus. She didn't even realize how chilly she'd gotten. But the stone hearth in the corner greeted her with flames crackling up against a fresh log, and she instantly felt better. Even her wing feathers had been cold. "Hello?" Daring called out. No pony was at the desk. Daring rang the bell on the counter 3 times. Ding, ding, ding. Suddenly Mrs. Trotsworth appeared. She looked the same as the last time Daring Do had seen her. A frizzy gray mane, a red plaid country dress, and a cloth napkin with various stains on it hanging from the apron around her waist. "Back again, dearie," she said before erupting into a fit of coughs. Daring nodded cordially. Same as before. She kept her head low so that her pith helmet covered her eyes. "And send up a bowl of that stew, please." "Of course," Mrs. Trotsworth replied. Her eyes began to twinkle. "And how will you be paying this time?" The last time Daring Do had come through here, all she'd had on her were some ancient gold coins she'd received from the forgotten palace of Tlatelolco. Daring had had no choice but to pony up a whole coin as payment. Begrudgingly, of course. She always kept smaller change with her now. As Daring procured the appropriate amount of money from her pocket, she considered that the previous gold coin should have been enough to pay for her to have the best room at the Get-On Inn for a year. "Just bits today, I'm afraid," Daring replied coolly as she tossed her payment on the counter. The coins landed with a loud clank, and Mrs. Trotsworth's expression morphed into a scowl. "Very well, then." She gathered the coins and dropped them into the near-empty register. The old mare busied herself, puttering around behind the counter, scribbling something down on a ledger and coughing. Mrs. Trotsworth snatched a rusty key from a hook labeled number 8. "Our best room," she said, like she was doing Daring a huge favor. Daring took note that all the keys were currently present on their hooks, except hers and the one for room number 3. She seriously doubted that all the guests were out and about this time of night, which could only mean that there were no guests. Usually the place was packed to full capacity. "Slow week?" Daring pointed her hoof at the wall. Mrs. Trotsworth grunted. "Same as any other lately. Business just ain't the same since all the robberies down south. No funny wants to visit the Tricorn villages any more." Mrs. Trotsworth pulled out a stack of fresh towels that were looking a bit worse for wear and slid them toward Daring. "Most of my customers used to be tourists on their way to Maripor, Lusitano, or Pohnpei. I'm the closest lodging to the region, but now, nothing." She stared out the window wistfully, as if she was gazing back into better days. "Robberies?" Daring echoed. She hadn't heard about any robberies, but the mysterious visitor had mentioned Maripor. Maybe that's what he was worried about. "Terrible, ain't it?" Mrs. Trotsworth sighed, back from her trance. "In fact, you're the only guest I've got tonight." "But what about room number 3? Daring gestured to the missing key. Mrs. Trotsworth shook her head in dismay. "A few hours back, a stallion came in wanting a room. He insisted on room 3. Then when I went to check in on him, he'd up and left without even so much as a goodbye. He still owed 4 bits, too. Can you believe it? And I don't even want to mention the state of the room." She slammed a hoof on the counter and gritted her teeth. "The nerve of some ponies." Now she had Daring Do's attention. Maybe there was a connection between the guest and her own visitor. Daring leaned in closer and brought her voice to a low rasp. "Was he wearing a green cloak, perchance? Messy golden mane?" "Well, I thought he had on a—" Mrs. Trotsworth stopped herself and looked at Daring Do sideways. "What's it to you?" Daring Do needed to tone it down with the nosy questions. Otherwise she might reveal something confidential. The last thing she needed right now was to have to explain her mission to some pony. She fumbled for another coin and tossed it to the old mare. That ought to loosen her lips a bit. "Yeah, I remember now," said Mrs. Trustworthy, inspecting the prize with a cheeky smirk. "He did have on a green cloak. What else do you want to know?" Daring smiled back. "Let's talk about it on our way to room number 3. Chapter 5. Room number 3. It was no wonder the innkeeper was perturbed. The room was an absolute mess. The bed sheets had been torn off the mattress and thrown across the floor. The plush pillows had been ripped apart, and the white feathers had exploded everywhere, causing the entire place to look like it had gotten almost an inch of downy snow. The flickering bedside lamp was overturned, and there was a trail of muddy hoofprints tracked all over the wooden panels of the barn floor. The work of a ruffian, one of Caballeron's men? It was her hench ponies who had trashed her cottage while searching for the last ring of Scorchero. "Looks like some pony wasn't raised in a barn," Daring Do said aloud, peeking under the tousled blankets. The innkeeper sniffed and left Daring Do alone to dig around. After Daring Do had searched the whole room high and low, she was incredibly disappointed. All she'd found was an old, half-used jar of Goops for Stuff hide ointment, and a crumbled piece of parchment with some circles scribbled on it. They meant nothing to her, but she stashed them in her bag anyway. It seemed that Cloak Pony had simply forgotten them on the table in all the madness of it all. It was too bad that he had left no other clues in his wake. The next morning, Daring Do awoke before dawn to find that her body was stiffer than the board on a pirate ship's plank. It was as if each wing and limb had been bound with a rope and tied to a sandbag. Though it was the first time in weeks she'd had a full night of sleep, it wasn't restful. She tossed and turned throughout the night, her mind hijacked by a disturbing dream that she'd been surrounded by hundreds of little animals crying out for her. She tried to shake the odd feeling it gave her, but she could still imagine their fuzzy faces and watery eyes. "Save us, Daring Do!" they pleaded. The plea mixed with that of the strangers and swirled above her head like a gray rain cloud. A sliver of morning light began to peek through the burlap curtains. Daring was about to go draw a hot bath to loosen up before she took off again, when a jar on the nightstand caught her attention. It was the hide ointment that had been left behind in room 3. "No time for a bath," she thought. "This will do perfectly to ease my aching muscles until I can relax." She scooped out a generous portion of the oily green goop and slathered it on her green and gold compass rose cutie mark. It smelled a bit sour. Daring looked at the jar again. Nothing on the bottle indicated it had gone bad. She shrugged. She rubbed the stuff in and made sure that it soaked into her flank and hind legs. A moment later, a tingling sensation took over, and she was able to stretch and walk once more. Daring Do was back in action, and ready to save some ponies by finding those Flankara relics. That is, if a certain raider hadn't gotten there first.